There is a specific kind of pain that has no name in English. It is the pain of understanding exactly what happened every step, every decision, every moment where you could have changed the outcome and knowing that the understanding arrived 1 week too late. Basil Crawford was a retired banker from New York who spent 35 years reading financial risk for a living. He knew what a bad deal smelled like. He had rejected thousands of them. What he could not reject, it turned out, was the one that arrived wearing the face of someone he trusted completely. By the time he started asking questions, the $375,000 was already gone. This is the story of a man who was not fooled slowly. He was fooled precisely at the exact speed required to ensure he would realize it too late. The document that broke me wasn't dramatic. It was a single page, a bank statement from the account where I thought $375,000 was sitting, growing quietly in a managed portfolio. The balance on that statement read 0. Not low, not reduced, 0. And the transaction history showed a series of outgoing wire transfers, the last one executed 11 days before I finally asked to see the paperwork. 11 days. I have thought about those 11 days more times than I can count. What I was doing during those 11 days. What Raven was doing. The distance between those two pictures is the whole story, and I'm going to tell it from the beginning because the beginning is the only place where any of it makes sense. I was 69 years old. I had spent 35 years at a mid-sized commercial bank in Manhattan, not one of the giants, but a serious institution with serious clients and a culture that did not tolerate sloppiness with other people's money. I had worked in credit risk for the first 15 years, moved into senior lending, and ended my career as a divisional vice president overseeing commercial portfolio management. I knew balance sheets. I knew cash flow analysis. I knew how to read a financial statement the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not just what's visible, but what the shape of it implies. I retired at 66 with a pension, a managed investment account that my former colleague Patrick had been overseeing for 12 years, and a savings cushion that represented 40 years of careful living. My wife Carol had died 4 years before I retired, a stroke, sudden, the kind that doesn't give you any paperwork. After she was gone, I stayed in our apartment on the Upper East Side for 2 years, and then I started to feel that I was living in a museum of my own life, and I booked a flight to Manila. The Philippines had been Carol's idea, originally. She'd always wanted to go. She'd read about it somewhere and circled it in a magazine she kept in the drawer of her nightstand. One of those travel magazines that arrived monthly and piled up unread and then got read all at once on a Sunday afternoon. I found the magazine after she died. The page was still circled. I went instead of both of us. That first trip, in the spring of 3 years ago now, I stayed for 6 weeks and then extended to 3 months. Manila was not what I expected. It was louder and more chaotic and more alive than I had prepared for. And the aliveness was what I needed without knowing I needed it. I took long walks. I read. I found a gym near my service department in Makati that was open at 5 in the morning, and I went every day, which I had not done with any consistency since my mid-50s. I met Raven at a networking event for foreign investors and business professionals. It was held at a hotel in BGC, the kind of event that always feels slightly too formal for the conversations happening inside it, with name badges and a moderator and a buffet that nobody touches until halfway through. I was there because a contact of mine from the New York banking world, a man named Ed who had been living in Manila for 3 years, had told me it was worth attending if I was thinking about any kind of local investment during my time here. Raven was presenting. She was a financial advisor with a boutique investment firm that worked specifically with foreign nationals and expats, navigating Philippine investment vehicles, UITFs, bonds, real estate investment structures, that category of thing. She was 42, precise in her presentation style, and she did something that very few people presenting financial products ever do. She told her audience clearly and specifically what the risks were before she talked about the returns. I noticed that immediately. In 35 years of banking, I had sat through more investment pitches than I could possibly tally, and the instinct to lead with risk mitigation before upside is not natural to salespeople. It is trained into professionals who understand that sophisticated clients trust caution more than enthusiasm. Raven understood her audience. That was the first thing she made me feel. Understood. We spoke during the networking portion afterward. She asked what my background was, and when I told her, she didn't try to impress me with vocabulary she would have used on a civilian. She spoke to me as a peer. She asked specific questions about commercial lending structures that only someone with genuine knowledge would know to ask. She had opinions about risk frameworks that were thoughtful and not entirely conventional. I found myself disagreeing with one of her points and saying so directly, and she pushed back without backing down, and we stood there arguing pleasantly about a technical aspect of portfolio construction for 20 minutes, while the room thinned out around us. Ed found me afterward and raised his eyebrows. "Basil," he said, "that was a serious conversation." "She knows what she's talking about," I said. "She does," he agreed. "She also knows that you know what she's talking about, which is rarer." I took her card. She called 3 days later not to pitch anything, just to continue the conversation. We met for lunch, then for dinner the following week. Then for a Sunday walk through Intramuros that lasted 4 hours and covered more ground intellectually than most conversations I'd had in the previous 3 years combined. She talked about the Philippine investment landscape with the granular knowledge of someone who'd been operating inside it for 15 years. She talked about her clients always with discretion, never by name, and the patterns she observed in how foreign nationals approached local investment with frameworks that didn't translate. I started to trust her before I was in any kind of romantic relationship with her. That matters. The trust was professional first. It was the trust you extend to a colleague whose work you've observed closely enough to evaluate. I evaluated it. I found it sound. And so when the relationship shifted gradually over the following months, the way it shifts when two people who spend a great deal of time together eventually acknowledge what's been building, the trust was already established on ground that felt solid to me. That solid ground was the point. That was what she had built before she needed it. My former colleague, Patrick, managed my investments from New York. He had been doing it for 12 years, and he was meticulous and conservative, and he sent me a quarterly report formatted in a way I'd asked him to format it back in 2012, and he had never once changed the format without checking with me first. Patrick was the kind of financial manager who treats your money the way a good house-sitter treats your home, not as if it were his own, but with a seriousness about its not being his own that makes you sleep well. I didn't tell Patrick about Raven for several months. Not from any deliberate concealment, more from the ordinary human tendency to keep the different rooms of your life separate until you're sure how they connect. Patrick knew I was in Manila. He didn't know the specifics of what my days there contained. When I did mention her, during a call in late autumn of that first extended stay, I described her as a financial professional I'd met through a networking event. I said she was knowledgeable and well regarded in the local market. I said she'd raised some interesting points about Philippine investment vehicles that might be worth looking at for diversification purposes. Patrick was characteristically measured. "What kind of vehicles?" he asked. "UITFs mainly, some bond positions." She mentioned a real estate investment structure, but she wasn't pushing it. She said the liquidity profile was wrong for most foreign investors, and she wouldn't recommend it for a primary holding. "That's a reasonable view," Patrick said carefully. "What are you thinking?" "Nothing yet," I said, "just listening." And that was true. For another 4 months, I was just listening. Raven never pushed. She raised ideas and then waited. She would mention an opportunity and then move on, the way someone who is genuinely confident in the quality of what they're offering doesn't need to sell it twice. She answered my questions, and I asked many, detailed, professionally calibrated questions with specificity and patience. She provided research. She cited sources I could and did check. She showed me track records for investment vehicles that I verified independently through public data. I found nothing wrong, not a single inconsistency in anything she presented. I have thought about this extensively, and I believe the explanation is not that she was showing me fabricated documents that happened to match public records. I believe she was showing me real data about real vehicles, establishing credibility over months of verifiable information, specifically because she knew that a former banker would check, and the checking was supposed to be the last barrier she needed to clear. She cleared it with patience. By the time the actual proposal arrived, the specific recommendation to move $375,000 into a managed account structure she would oversee directly, my professional skepticism had been systematically addressed. Every question I might have asked had already been answered, preemptively, across months of conversation. The trust had been constructed so carefully that by the time I was sitting with the proposal in front of me, I wasn't reading it with a banker's eyes. I was reading it with the eyes of a man who had already decided. I told Patrick about it. That call, I remember with a clarity that I find sometimes unbearable. I explained the proposal. Patrick listened. Then he said, "Basil, you know I trust your judgment on this kind of analysis." "But," I said. I could hear the shape of a but. But she'd be managing it directly. Not through a custodial account with an independent institution. Directly, as I understand it. "Through her firm," I said. "It's a registered firm. I've verified the registration." "I know you have," he said. "I'm just noting that the structure puts the oversight and the management in the same hands." I knew he was right. In 35 years of banking, I had seen that structure fail before, in much larger contexts and with more elaborate safeguards than what Raven was proposing. The absence of independent custodial oversight is a textbook risk factor. I knew it was a textbook risk factor. I noted it, weighed it against everything I thought I knew about Raven, and decided that what I knew about her was more reliable than what the textbook said. That decision cost me $375,000. I transferred the money in 2 tranches, $200,000 in February, $175,000 6 weeks later, when she explained that the second tranche would allow a position in a bond vehicle that had a subscription window closing at the end of the month. I remember signing both transfer authorizations with the calm of a man executing a plan he's thoroughly considered. I felt no anxiety. I felt the particular satisfaction of deliberate action, the feeling of having done the analysis and committed to the conclusion. After the second transfer, she sent me a portfolio summary. It showed both tranches allocated across a set of positions she'd described during our planning conversations. The allocation looked right. The notation style was professional. I read it carefully and filed it. She called every 2 weeks. We met in person at least twice a month, sometimes for a professional update over coffee, more often for dinner or a long Sunday afternoon that had nothing to do with finance. She talked about her clients, her work, her family, a mother in Quezon City she visited every Sunday, a younger brother she was helping put through graduate school. She was warm and present and gave no sign whatsoever of anything except the relationship I thought we had. I gave Patrick a broad update in April. The positions were performing moderately. I told him nothing spectacular, consistent with what Raven had projected. He asked if I'd received formal account statements from the custodial institution. I said I'd received portfolio summaries from Raven directly. He was quiet for a moment. "Basil," he said, "you should be receiving statements from the institution itself, not just from the advisor." "I'll ask her to set that up," I said. I didn't ask her immediately. I told myself I'd bring it up at our next meeting. At our next meeting, we ended up talking for 3 hours about something else entirely, a conversation about her brother's academic progress, and then a long tangent about a book we'd both been reading, and I didn't raise it. I told myself I'd bring it up by phone during the week. The week passed. I made a note in my calendar to follow up and then move the note forward twice. This is the part that tortures me most. Not the initial decision to transfer the money. That decision I can construct a logic for, even a flawed one. The part that tortures me is the following 8 weeks, during which Patrick's concern sat clearly in my mind, during which the simple action of asking for independent account statements remained undone, during which I found reasons, not even convincing reasons, just reasons to defer. I have asked myself why. I have asked Dr. Weston, the therapist I've been seeing since I returned to New York, the same question repeatedly. His answer, which I think is correct, is that I was protecting something, Not the money. I didn't consciously think the money was in danger. I was protecting the version of events I had built. Asking for independent statements was an act that implied, however slightly, that I didn't completely trust the picture I was being shown. And not completely trusting the picture meant not completely trusting Raven. And not completely trusting Raven meant looking squarely at a relationship I had invested a great deal of myself in and asking whether the investment was sound. I was 69 years old. I had been alone for 6 years. I had built something in Manila, a life, a warmth, a reason to stay in rooms that didn't feel empty, and the asking of a simple professional question was the thing that might begin to unravel it. So I moved the note forward in my calendar, twice. It was Ed who finally handed me the thread I should have pulled myself. We had lunch in June, a standing arrangement we kept roughly monthly, good food and honest conversation about expat life in Manila, the kind of friendship that forms between men who have both moved a long way from where they came from. Toward the end of the meal he mentioned, carefully, that he'd heard something through a mutual contact in the expat finance community. "What kind of something?" I said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The firm Raven works with," he said. "I heard there was an SEC inquiry. Nothing confirmed it secondhand. But I thought you should know." I thanked him. I drove back to my apartment. I sat down at my desk and I pulled out the portfolio summaries, and I looked at them with different eyes than I'd brought to them before. Not the eyes of a man reviewing his own analyst's work. The eyes of a banker reviewing documents he's been handed by someone he's no longer fully sure he should trust. What I saw, this time, was what I should have seen months earlier. The portfolio summaries were detailed and professionally formatted. They were also, and this was not immediately obvious, it required the kind of careful analysis I'd been consciously not performing, not structured in a way that any regulated Philippine investment institution would produce them. The position notations used terminology that was slightly off, not wrong exactly. Slightly off, in the way that something is slightly off when it's been constructed to look real by someone who understands the format well but not perfectly. I called Raven that evening. I kept my voice level. I told her I needed to see the original account statements from the custodial institution, not the portfolio summaries, the raw statements from the institution itself. She said, of course, she'd have them to me within a few days. She had a meeting the following morning, but she'd get to it right after. I said, fine. I hung up. I sat in the dark apartment for a long time. I called Patrick the next morning. I told him everything, the full picture, all of it. The transfers, the summaries, Ed's information, the phone call. Patrick was quiet for a longer time than I'd ever heard him be quiet. Then he said, "I'm going to get on a call with our fraud team and I'm going to call you back in 2 hours." He called back in 90 minutes. "Basil," he said, "I need you to access your transfer records right now. I need the destination account numbers for both tranches." I pulled them up. I read them to him. He read them to someone else in the room with him. Then he said quietly, "Those accounts are closed, both of them, closed within days of the transfers being received." The room did something. I don't have a better description than that. The room did something, and I sat very still in the middle of it. "When?" I said. "The first account closed in late February," he said, "about 3 weeks after your first transfer." 3 weeks. I had been receiving portfolio summaries for 4 months. Portfolio summaries describing positions in accounts that had been closed within 3 weeks of the money arriving. "Patrick," I said. "I know," he said. "The money. Gone," he said. "I'm sorry, Basil. It's gone." I called Raven back that same afternoon. She answered. She always answered, until the day she didn't, which was 2 days later. But on that afternoon she still answered, and her voice was exactly the same as it had always been, warm, direct, professionally present. "The accounts are closed," I said. "Both of them. I've confirmed it." A pause, shorter than it should have been, if she were surprised. "That's not possible," she said. "There must be an error with whoever you spoke to. The positions are active. I reviewed them this morning." "The accounts closed in February," I said. 3 weeks after the first transfer. Another pause. I noticed, this time, that she wasn't asking me how I knew. She wasn't asking me what source I'd used, or suggesting I might have the wrong account numbers, or expressing any of the alarm that someone genuinely surprised by this information would express. She was calculating. I could feel it through the phone the way you feel the weight of silence when it's being managed rather than experienced. "I need to make some calls," she said. "Let me look into this and call you back this evening." She called back that evening. She said she was very concerned and that she was investigating urgently and that she was sure there was an explanation. She said her compliance officer was involved and that she would have documentation for me by Friday. Friday came. No documentation. No call. I called her number 3 times. Voicemail each time. I went to the address of her firm. The office existed a serviced co-working space in a building near Ayala Avenue. The reception staff confirmed she'd been renting a workstation there. Confirmed she'd been there as recently as Wednesday. Confirmed she'd vacated the space on Thursday morning, one day before she was supposed to have documentation for me. I stood in that lobby for a long time. I thought about the 11 days. The account had been emptied 11 days before I called her about the statements. She had known, when I called, that the money was already gone. She had answered the phone with her normal voice, told me there must be an error, bought herself 2 more days, and then closed up the workstation and stopped answering. The whole time I was asking my questions, the thing I was asking about had already happened. The theft was complete. The window was closed. The only thing my questions had accomplished was to let her know it was time to leave. I reported everything to the SEC in the Philippines and to the PNP's anti-cybercrime group. I retained a law firm in Makati. I verified them through the integrated bar. I was done with taking professional credentials on faith, and I instructed Patrick to coordinate with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit from the New York side, which he did immediately and without hesitation. Ed came with me to the first SEC meeting and sat beside me in that government office and said nothing but stayed the whole 3 hours, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. The investigation confirmed the shape of what I already knew. Raven, the name, was real, at least Raven Gutierrez. Though the surname she'd used at the networking event was a professional alias, had operated a variant of this scheme at least twice before with other foreign investors, neither of whom had reported it formally. The firm was a shell registered legitimately enough to pass the kind of verification I'd performed, but with no actual investment activity, no custodial relationships, no regulated operations of any kind. The portfolio summaries I'd received were fabricated. The accounts that had received my transfers had been opened specifically to receive them and closed within weeks of doing so. The money had moved through a series of intermediary accounts, the trail degrading at each step, in a pattern the investigators described as consistent with professional money laundering infrastructure. The SEC officer who briefed me was a careful woman named Addie Mendez, who laid out the information without softening it. She told me recovery was possible, but statistically unlikely, given the stage the funds were at. She told me the case would be pursued. She told me I had cooperated thoroughly and that my documentation was among the most organized she'd received in a case of this type. I thanked her. I walked out of the building into the Manila afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment and let the heat sit on my face and thought about the last 3 years and all the ways I had been exactly as careful as I thought I was being, and exactly as careless as I was, simultaneously, in the same decisions. Ed was waiting outside. He asked if I wanted a drink. I told him I wanted about 12, but that I'd settle for coffee. We walked to a cafe nearby and sat for 2 hours and didn't talk about the money much. We talked about other things. What it's like to build a life somewhere far from where you started. What you lose when you trust wrong and what you risk when you trust not at all. How you navigate the space between those two positions, which turns out to be the space where most of adult life actually happens. She was good, I said at some point. Yes, Ed said. She spent months being credible. Months of real information, real analysis, accurate predictions. She was building a track record so I'd have something to verify. She knew you'd verify, he said. She built what could be verified, and she made what couldn't be verified feel like an afterthought. That was it, exactly. The thing you can check is rarely the thing that matters. What matters is the structure holding the checkable thing in place, and that structure is built from things you can't see unless you're specifically looking for the invisible scaffolding. I had looked at every visible beam. I had not looked for the scaffolding. My daughter Karen flew to Manila when I told her. She arrived 2 days after I'd been to the SEC, and she came straight from the airport to my apartment and sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her in the precise way she's folded them since. She was a child when she's about to say something serious. "Dad," she said, "are you okay?" "I'm intact," I said. "The financial picture has changed, but I'm intact." "That's not what I asked." I looked at my hands. "No," I said. "I'm not okay right now. I'll get to okay, but right now, I'm not there." She stayed for 2 weeks. She didn't say anything that resembled blame, which I was grateful for because the self-directed version was already comprehensive. She helped me organize the legal documentation. She called Patrick from my apartment twice and took notes on his legal advice. She cooked dinner every night in the small apartment kitchen in a way that made the space feel inhabited rather than occupied by a single man sitting with his thoughts. The evening before she left, she asked me something I'd been half expecting. "Did you love her?" I thought about it honestly. "I trusted her," I said, which, at 69, living alone on the other side of the world from everyone I know, that might have been the same thing. Karen didn't answer that. She just nodded slowly, which was the right response. There's no useful thing to say to that sentence. It's just the truth, sitting on the table between two people who can see it clearly and can't do anything with it except look at it. I am back in New York now. The Upper East Side apartment, the view of the park, the morning gym sessions I've maintained because they were good for me before Manila, and they're good for me now. Patrick and I have done a full restructuring of what remains. The pension is intact. The savings outside the Manila transfers are intact. The investment portfolio is reduced, but not destroyed. I will not retire into the life I had planned. Exactly. I will retire into a modified version of it, which is something I can live with. The $375,000 is gone. The SEC investigation continues, and I hold no serious expectation of recovery, Addie. Mendez was honest with me about the odds, and I am not the kind of man who benefits from comfortable fictions. The legal process will complete itself in whatever time it takes, and whatever it produces, it will produce, and I have separated my emotional state from that outcome as cleanly as I can manage. What I haven't been able to separate my emotional state from, and what Dr. Weston and I have spent a great many sessions sitting with, is the 11 days, not the loss itself. The 11 days before the loss was discovered, during which the thing had already happened, and I didn't know, and everything looked normal, and Raven answered the phone in her normal voice, and all of it was already done. If I had called Patrick in late May, when he first raised the question of independent statements, if I had followed up the following week, instead of moving the calendar note, if I had asked Raven directly for custodial statements when Ed mentioned the SEC inquiry rather than waiting another 3 days, any of those moments, the funds were still theoretically traceable. The accounts hadn't been fully emptied. The transfers were still in progress. In the early stages of a fraud like this, there are brief windows where a sufficiently fast response can freeze funds before they move beyond reach. I was within 2 weeks of one of those windows when I started asking questions. I missed it by 11 days. There's no way to make that fact feel better. Dr. Weston doesn't try to make it feel better. He acknowledges the precision of it, the maddening, specific, 11-day precision of it, and then he asks me what I intend to do with the energy I'm spending on it. He asks me what purpose the replaying serves. He asks me whether the man who moved that calendar note forward twice had access to information the man sitting in his office now has access to. He didn't. That's the honest answer. The man who moved the calendar note forward was operating on everything he knew at the time, which was a great deal of carefully selected information provided by someone who understood exactly which information would produce which responses. I was not negligent through laziness. I was negligent through a combination of professional respect and emotional investment that had been specifically cultivated to produce that negligence. I was a good mark, not despite my expertise, but because of it. She didn't fool me by hiding from my professional knowledge. She used my professional knowledge to fool me, showed me what I was trained to look for, gave me what I was trained to verify, and left unexamined the one structural flaw that my training had taught me to check in every other context of my career. That is the part I have to carry. Not the $375,000, though I carry that too. The knowledge that my strength was the door. That the same 35 years that should have protected me were the precise thing she used to get past my defenses. She didn't need me to be ignorant. She needed me to be confident. And I was. I spoke at an expat financial safety workshop in Manila 2 months before I came home. Ed organized it, a small gathering of foreign nationals, mostly retired professionals, men and women who had built lives in the Philippines and who were, many of them, managing significant personal assets in a regulatory environment they understood less well than they thought. I didn't prepare extensively. I just talked about what had happened to me, in the same sequence I've told it here, with the same specific detail and the same absence of softening. A man in the back row, American, 70s, clearly a professional background, raised his hand at the end. He said, "You're one of the most financially sophisticated people I've heard describe something like this. If it happened to you, what chance do the rest of us have?" I thought about it for a moment. "It happened to me specifically because of my financial sophistication," I said, "not in spite of it." She calibrated the fraud to my level of verification. She showed me what a banker checks. What she didn't show me was what a banker who trusted himself too much forgets to check. He nodded slowly. "The protection isn't more expertise," I said. "The protection is independent oversight. No exceptions. It doesn't matter how well you think you know someone, how thoroughly you've verified their credentials, how many months of credible information they've shown you. If your money is somewhere, you need an independent institution confirming it's there, in statements that come directly to you, not through the advisor. That's the rule. Not my rule, the rule. The rule that exists specifically because the people who are most confident they don't need it are the people who need it most." The room was quiet. "I knew that rule," I said. "I've known it for 35 years. And I didn't apply it, because I was in a situation where applying it felt like distrust, and the situation had been deliberately constructed to make distrust feel costly." I flew home 3 weeks later. The apartment on the Upper East Side was waiting exactly as I'd left it, neat, quiet, full of the presence of Carol's absence that has become, over the years, its own kind of company. I put my bag down and opened the window that looks over the park and stood there for a while in the spring air. Karen calls every Sunday. Patrick calls on the first of every month, and we talk through the numbers with the steady professional rhythm that has characterized our relationship for 15 years. Ed sends me articles about Manila food spots, political developments, the ongoing complexity of a city he loves and that I think, on some level, I still love too, for reasons that have nothing to do with Raven and everything to do with the version of myself I found there, the one who walked for hours and argued about books and discovered, at 67, that he still had the capacity to be fully engaged with being alive. That version is still here. The $375,000 is not. I'm learning, slowly, to hold both of those facts without letting either one erase the other. It takes time. Some mornings it takes more than others. But I am 69 years old, and I spent 35 years being careful with other people's money, and I understand, now, at a depth that no seminar or training program ever reached, what it costs to stop being careful with your own. That understanding is worth something. Not $375,000, but something. And I am still, on the mornings when the park is green below the window and the coffee is strong and the city is doing what cities do, still here, still thinking, still, in the ways that matter, intact. That is what I have. For now, at 69, with everything adjusted and accounted for, it is enough to build from.